No matter what you're a fan of, you can probably think of two characters who fit the description. Holmes and Watson, Brennan and Booth, Kirk and Spock, Ron and Hermione. They're close, they understand each other in ways that others don't, and you really can't picture one without the other. But when stuff happens, they usually react in different ways. Like if you're snooping around Hogwarts at night and you come across some beastie, the smart money's on Hermione to come up with a spell that saves the day, while Ron probably standing there with his mouth open. And when Sherlock starts to go crazy because there hasn't been a fiendishly clever jewel heist or whatever for him to figure out, you can count on Watson to calm him down. Mostly. My brother John, who is a writer of books, will tell you that these characters are foils. They're not opposites exactly, they're contrasts. And the more you see them together, the more they seem to complement or round one another out. And that is basically your autonomic nervous system in a nutshell. Your autonomic system is the branch of your peripheral nervous system that regulates the functions of your internal organs, like your heart and stomach, and also controls your smooth and cardiac muscles, and your glands. All things that you do not consciously control, so yes, you could say it has a lot of power over you. But the funny, or maybe confusing thing about this system is that its effects on your organs and muscles and glands are by no means consistent. Not at all. At any given moment, whether you happen to be totally relaxed or completely flipping your wig, your autonomic system is constantly making involuntary, fine-tuned adjustments to your body based on what signals your central nervous system is picking up. This could mean changing your body temperature, sending extra blood to a particular area, slowing your heartbeat, or tweaking your stomach secretions. Its effects change depending on the situation you're in, and also which part of your autonomic system is in charge at that moment. Because this weird little corner of your nervous system that keeps you alive is actually run by two competing interests. Two divisions that serve the same organs, but they create opposite effects in them, battling it out back and forth to either excite your body's functions or subdue them. One of them is dedicated to amping you up and preparing you for activity, that's your sympathetic nervous system, and the other one talks you down and effectively undoes what its foil did, and that is the parasympathetic nervous system. Together, they are what make your body experience stress, fear, relaxation, and defiance, courage and cowardice, panic and peace. If there's an epic novel going on in your body right now, it is probably being written by these two. Let's talk about names for a minute. One of the two divisions of your autonomic nervous system is called the sympathetic system. That sounds kind of nice, doesn't it? It's like understanding and calming and telling you that it's not so bad after all. Wrong! Contrary to its comforting name, the sympathetic system is what sounds your internal alarm bells. It's the hardware behind the famous fight-or-flight response. It is synonymous with stress. If the sympathetic is for fight or flight, the parasympathetic is for resting and digesting. It's responsible for maintaining your body and conserving energy for later. I recognize that this is confusing. So you're sound asleep when your smoke alarm goes off. Before you even know what's going on, you start to feel it. Those smoke alarms are loud for a good reason. Your heart starts to race, your breathing picks up, you become sweaty all over your body. You are stressed. And I'm not talking about the my iPhone just died kind of stress. I'm talking about the I'm afraid I might die kind of stress. Even though it's often seen as a dirty word, stress, like pain, isn't all bad. It's actually very useful if you're, trying to get out of a burning building. Your sympathetic nervous system is the part of your nervous system that responds to stress, and it does its job exceedingly well by focusing on what your body needs to do right now. Like when you're facing a life or death ordeal, you don't need to be digesting that cashew cluster in your intestines or producing reproductive cells or fighting off an infection. That's all stuff you can deal with later when you're out of harm's way, so your sympathetic nervous system sweeps these suddenly trivial functions aside to blast all of your energy to your brain and heart and muscles to deal with the threat at hand. So this is where I tell you that you're lucky to have a sympathetic nervous system and that it keeps you alive and that you would probably die in X period of time if you didn't have one. All of which is true, but here's the thing. The problem is, nowadays our body's stress responses are triggered all the time, practically every day, even when we are not in mortal danger. I mean, worrying about paying your wireless bill or being late for an important meeting, those things are terrible, but they will not kill you. But good luck explaining that to your nervous system, because your physiological responses to non-immediate stresses are largely the same as when you're fighting for survival. So if stress is like ruining your life, that's why. And that's part of the reason you should get to know how it works. Because by learning about your sympathetic nervous system, you come to understand one of the key players in the physiology of stress. You may recall from our tour of the anatomy of your autonomic nervous system that in both your sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions, almost every signal has to cross two synapses. Each neuron travels from its root in the spinal cord to a ganglion where it synapses, and yes, that is a verb as well, with another nerve fiber. And that one, in turn, leads to an effector organ where it synapses again to create whatever response was signaled, like sending more blood to your skeletal muscles or making your heart pump faster. But you gotta wonder, or at least I gotta wonder, how do these neurons and effectors actually communicate with each other, and how do all of those signals result in the high-octane sensations that we know as stress? By and large, the stress response includes two kinds of chemicals, both of which I'm sure you've heard of. The first, of course, are neurotransmitters. These are made and released from neurons themselves, and like we talked about in our lesson about synapses, they are what neurons use to communicate with each other or their effector organs across a synapse. The other chemicals involved in stress are hormones, which are secreted by your glands. There are at least 50 different hormones at work in your body right now, and they do everything from regulating your sleep cycles to making your body retain water so you're not dying of dehydration all over the place. I'm telling you all this now up front because hormones and neurotransmitters are 100% necessary for understanding how your sympathetic division ultimately works. But when you trace a single sympathetic signal from the initial stimulus to the final response, those chemicals can be kind of hard to keep track of. That's because the very same substance can have different effects, actually sometimes totally opposite effects depending on where it's received in your body. And to make things even more fun, even though neurotransmitters are part of your nervous system and hormones are products of your endocrine system, a compound can be considered either a neurotransmitter or a hormone even though it hasn't changed one iota depending on where it happens to be operating in your body. Consider your heart for a moment. For the average person at rest, like you probably are sitting there watching me, the heart beats at around 60 beats per minute. Once a second, nice and easy. But if you were to somehow disconnect your heart from your autonomic nervous system, things, as you might imagine, would change. But your heart would not stop. Actually, it would be the opposite. It would speed up. It would start beating at around 100 beats per minute, and that's just at rest. With your heart beating 2/3 faster than normal before you even broke a sweat, your cardiac muscle would experience a lot of extra wear and tear, the surrounding blood vessels would be under enormous pressure, and your body would suddenly require and waste a lot of energy. Basically, you'd be out of balance. Part of what keeps your heart under control is your parasympathetic nervous system. It's often described as the calming side of your autonomic system, a kind of antidote to the effects of stress created by the sympathetic system. But it's really much more than that. Unlike your sympathetic division, which lets you deal with the crisis of the now, the parasympathetic system allows your body to handle everything else. It not only calms you down after being stressed out, it's what allows you to digest food, to reproduce, to excrete waste, to fight off infections. Basically, it lets you do the business of living. But our bodies can only do that when they are in balance somewhere between excitement and inhibition, both aroused enough and calm enough to keep things working. So the parasympathetic system is why our hearts don't pump so hard that they explode, sure, but it also explains a lot of other stuff about our bodies. Oh, but just one thing. Learning about the parasympathetic system is going to involve a lot of memorizing. Hope that doesn't stress you out. You will recall that our sympathetic and parasympathetic systems not only have different functions, more or less engaging the same organs to opposite effects, they also have different structures. Their ganglia, for example, are located in different places. The sympathetic ganglia are located near the spinal cord, while on the parasympathetic side, they're close to the effectors. And likewise, the use of neurotransmitters in the two systems is similar, but not quite the same. In both systems, neurons release acetylcholine, or ACH, in their preganglionic synapses. But in your parasympathetic system, the postganglionic neurons release ACH at their synapses with the effector organs too, as opposed to in the sympathetic system where the effectors get a dose of norepinephrine instead. But the biggest anatomical difference between these two systems has to do with the physical networks that they form as they reach throughout your body. While the sympathetic nerves all spring from the thoracolumbar area of your spinal cord, right around your midsection, the nerves of the parasympathetic division are craniosacral. And with the exception of a couple of sacral nerves near the tailbone that run to the bladder and genitals genitals and rectum, most of these nerves never go through the spinal cord. Instead, they run right from the brain, almost all the way to their effectors. But if you're gonna commit one cranial nerve type to memory, it should be 10, the vagus nerve. This long and extensive nerve stretches from near the brainstem down to most of your visceral organs, including your heart, lungs, and stomach. The vagus nerves work as a two-way street, ferrying incoming sensory information from the peripheral system to the brain and transmitting outgoing motor instructions from the brain to the rest of the body. So it's a B nerve because it has both sensory and motor functions, and usually you don't notice this nerve at work because its functions are mostly automatic. So you've had a really stressful day, so your sympathetic system is charged up, you come home, crash on the couch, mow down a half a pizza. Your stomach sends signals to your brain through the sensory nerve axons in your vagus nerve, telling you that your belly is full of starch and protein and fat. Your brain sees that your stomach is churning away, which is a usual parasympathetic activity, so it sends signals back down through the vagus nerve, triggering other parasympathetic responses, like slowing down your heart rate, putting some glucose back into storage, and reducing all that norepinephrine that your sympathetic system was pumping out all day. Soon, you start feeling more relaxed, which is just one reason why for some people eating is a way of reducing stress and anxiety. In fact, it can feel so good that even though your stomach is full, you might continue eating. So, like I mentioned before, it can be easy to think of the two divisions of your autonomic system as opposites or even rivals, but that's a little off the mark. Looking at your body as a whole, you should picture them as two sides of a scale. Sometimes it's balanced in the middle, and sometimes it leans to the left or right depending on what's happening. That balance is the essence of homeostasis, and as you'll recall, homeostasis is the key to life. Here's something else that's important for life. Sex. It mostly falls within the parasympathetic domain of necessary, but not an emergency. But in order to effectively do it, you need help for both systems. First, the parasympathetic system has to make sure you're calm enough to even think about sex, and then funnel extra blood away from your muscles and down to your genitals, which is why too much stress and anxiety can lead to sexual dysfunction. But you also need a burst of that sympathetic system to excite you and keep you excited. So like the two sides of the scale, the balance depends on having the right amount of both. The rate of action potential traveling through each division is known as your sympathetic tone and your parasympathetic tone. And most of the time, our parasympathetic tone is actually dominant, keeping down the caged animal that is your sympathetic response. That's why you need your parasympathetic system to keep your heart from racing like a rabbit's, and why most of the time our bodies can do the eating and sex having and all the other fun tasks that make up the business of living.
Over the course of our lifetimes, our bodies undergo a series of extraordinary metamorphoses. We grow, experience puberty, and many of us reproduce. Behind the scenes, the endocrine system works constantly to orchestrate these changes. Alongside growth and sexual maturity, this system regulates everything from your sleep to the rhythm of your beating heart, exerting its influence over each and every one of your cells. The endocrine system relies on interactions between three features to do its job: glands, hormones, and trillions of cell receptors. Firstly, there are several hormone-producing glands, 3 in your brain and 7 in the rest of your body. Each is surrounded by a network of blood vessels, from which they extract ingredients to manufacture dozens of hormones. Those hormones are then pumped out in tiny amounts, usually into the bloodstream. From there, each hormone needs to locate a set of target cells in order to bring about a specific change. To find its targets, it's helped along by receptors, which are special proteins inside or on the cell's surface. Those receptors recognize specific hormones as they waft by and bind to them. When this happens, that hormone-receptor combination triggers a range of effects that either increase or decrease specific processes inside the cell to change the way that cell behaves. By exposing millions of cells at a time to hormones in carefully regulated quantities, the endocrine system drives large-scale changes across the body. Take, for instance, the thyroid and the two hormones it produces, triiodothyronine and thyroxine. These hormones travel to most of the body's cells, where they influence how quickly those cells use energy and how rapidly they work. In turn, that regulates everything from breathing rate to heartbeat, body temperature, and digestion. Hormones also have some of their most visible and familiar effects during puberty. In men, puberty begins when the testes start secreting testosterone. That triggers the gradual development of the sexual organs, makes facial hair sprout, and causes the voice to deepen and height to increase. In women, estrogen secreted from the ovaries signals the start of adulthood. It helps the body develop, makes the hips widen, and thickens the womb's lining, preparing the body for menstruation or pregnancy. An enduring misconception around the endocrine system is that there are exclusively male and female hormones. In fact, men and women have estrogen and testosterone, just in different amounts. Both hormones play a role in pregnancy as well, alongside more than 10 other hormones that ensure the growth of the fetus, enable birth, and help the mother feed her child. Such periods of hormonal change are also associated with fluctuations in mood. That's because hormones can influence the production of certain chemicals in the brain, like serotonin. When chemical levels shift, they may cause changes in mood as well. But that's not to say that hormones have unlimited power over us. They're frequently viewed as the main drivers of our behavior, making us slaves to their effects, especially during puberty. But research shows that our behavior is collectively shaped by a variety of influences, including the brain and its neurotransmitters, our hormones, and various social factors. The primary function of the endocrine system is to regulate our bodily processes, not control us. Sometimes disease, stress, and even diet can disrupt that regulatory function, however, altering the quantity of hormones that glands secrete or changing the way that cells respond. Diabetes is one of the most common hormonal disorders, occurring when the pancreas secretes too little insulin, a hormone that manages blood sugar levels, and hypo and hyperthyroidism occur when the thyroid gland makes too little or too much thyroid hormone. When there's too little thyroid hormone, that results in a slowed heart rate, fatigue, and depression. And when there's too much thyroid hormone, weight loss, sleeplessness, and irritability. But most of the time, the endocrine system manages to keep our bodies in a state of balance. And through its constant regulation, it drives the changes that ultimately help us become who we are.
I've invited you all here today because I wanted to talk to you about some ugly stereotypes that are going around. I've been hearing a lot of unfair, unseemly, and unscientific generalizations being made lately, and they mostly have to do with sex and your hormones. People have a nasty habit of equating hormones with a particular set of behaviors and conditions, most of which have to do with reproduction or sexual development or acts that include what my brother John has referred to as scootily pooping. For example, people will say that hormones are why Kevin has zits and is being all moody, or why Hannah, who's 3 months pregnant, just cried watching a commercial for car insurance, which, let's be honest, I do that too. Now, I'm not saying that hormones aren't at the root of sexual attraction or zits or occasional bouts of extreme emotion, because they are. That's just not all that they do. Not even close. When people talk about hormones in the context that I just mentioned, what they really mean is sex hormones. But sex hormones are just one kind of hormone that you have coursing through your body right now. In fact, there are at least 50 different types of these chemical messengers at work in your body at this very minute, but only a very few of them have anything at all to do with sex. The truth is, from birth to death, just about every cell and function in your body is under your hormones' constant influence. They're floating through your blood, regulating your metabolism, your sleep cycle, your response to stress, and the general and incredibly important overall homeostasis that keeps you not dead. Some hormones are just there to make other hormones trigger even more hormones in a kind of chemical relay race that biologists refer to rather elegantly as cascades. These hormones run through your body no matter what your mood is or whether you have zits. So the reality is, we are all hormonal, all the time. Okay, to begin to understand our hormones and the endocrine system that produces, releases, and reabsorbs them, we have to step back and take a broad view. Not just by emphasizing that sex hormones are not the only hormones you have, but also by looking at how your hormones interact with your other organ systems. Because if anything, your body has two bosses, two complementary systems that are constantly shouting instructions over each other to all your bits and pieces. Both your endocrine system and your nervous system are constantly trafficking information around your corpus, gathering intel, making demands commands controlling your every move. They just have totally different ways of doing it. Your nervous system uses lightning-fast electrochemical action potentials delivered by an expressway made of neurons to specific cells and organs. But your endocrine system prefers a slower, wider stream of data. It secretes hormones that travel through your blood, not through neurons, so they move more slowly, but they also produce widespread effects that last a whole lot longer than an action potential. Now, compared to your heart or brain or other arguably more glamorous organs, your endocrine system's organs and glands are kinda small and lumpy. They're also rogues. Instead of being all nestled together like in your other organ systems, these guys are scattered all over the place, from your brain to your throat to your kidneys to your genitals. A gland is just any structure that makes and secretes a hormone, and the master gland in your body is the pituitary, which produces many hormones that signal other glands, like the thyroid, parathyroid, adrenal, and pineal glands, to make their own hormones. The endocrine system also includes a few organs, like the gonads, the pancreas, and the placenta in pregnant women, all of which have some other non-hormonal functions and are made up of multiple tissue types. And technically the hypothalamus in your brain is in the endocrine club too, since in addition to all of its busy brain duties, it does produce and release hormones. So thanks to all these glands and organs, you've got these hormones diffusing through your blood doing all sorts of different things, but the thing to remember about them is that a hormone can only trigger a reaction in specific cells. They're so-called target cells that have the right receptors for it. So just like some keys can open many locks while others only work with one, so too can the hormone-target cell relationship either be widespread or localized. You're probably going to want an example of that, so your thyroid at the bottom of your throat produces the hormone thyroxine, which stimulates metabolism and binds to receptors in most of the cells in your body. But your pituitary, which is nestled all comfy under your brain, produces follicle-stimulating hormone, which helps regulate growth and trigger sexual maturity, and it only targets specific cells in the ovaries and testes. So, how do hormones bind to their target cells? Well, chemically, most hormones are either made of amino acids, including their more complex structures like peptides or proteins, or they're derived from lipids like cholesterol. And this is key because a hormone's chemical structure determines if it's water-soluble, like most amino acid-based ones are, or lipid-soluble, like steroids are. Solubility is important because your cell membranes are made of lipids. That means that water-soluble ones can't get across them, so target cells for those kinds of hormones have receptors on the outside of their membranes. Lipid-soluble hormones, on the other hand, can just basically glide right through that cell membrane, so their receptor sites are inside the target cells. Either way, when a target cell is activated, the hormone alters its activity by either increasing or decreasing some of its functions, usually with the goal of maintaining your body's homeostasis in one way or another. So, if hormones are keeping your body in balance, what's putting your body out of balance? I don't know. Could I interest you in some pie? If you have a couple of nice, generous helpings of strawberry rhubarb pie, and just to make things interesting, let's say they're a la mode, your blood glucose level is gonna go through the roof. And the pancreas regulates your blood sugar by releasing two different hormones, insulin and glucagon. Once you have a belly full of that pie, beta cells in your pancreas release insulin, which helps lower your blood sugar by increasing the rate at which your cells store the sugar either as glycogen or as fat for later use. Now let's say you've done the opposite. You've eaten no pie. You're pieless. In fact, you've eaten nothing for hours. If your blood sugar drops too low, then alpha cells in the pancreas will instead send out glucagon, which helps raise your blood sugar levels, in part by decreasing the storage of sugar in your cells and triggering the release of glucose back into the blood. Lots of different endocrine-related illnesses, like diabetes or hyperthyroidism, tend to be the result of either hyper, too much, or hypo, too little secretion of certain hormones, which throw your homeostasis off balance. But there are lots of more common and less obvious ways your hormones can get out of balance, not because of some disorder, but because these signaling chemicals are just caught up in a chain reaction, which can take a while to subside. Some hormones just exist to control other hormones, which in turn control still more hormones. So as soon as one starts to trickle out, you can pretty quickly wind up with a cascade on your hands. You got a few different hormone cascades going on at any given moment, but one of the big ones, one that's really worth understanding, is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or the HPA axis, because you don't want to have to say that every time. This is a complex series of interactions between three glands that ultimately regulates lots of your body's daily processes, like digestion, sexuality, immune response, and how you handle stress. And it's complex not just because of all the glands involved. It's also one of the more crucial instances of your endocrine system coordinating with your nervous system. Specifically, it's behind that fight-or-flight response that everybody keeps talking about. The HPA axis is essentially the endocrine system's companion to the sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic system, in times of high stress, does things like speed up your heart rate and direct blood away from your digestive organs into the muscles. But many of the other effects of the stress response are carried out by your endocrine system, and getting your nervous and endocrine systems to work together in times of crisis is where the hypothalamus comes in. It's the hub of where the two systems meet. It keeps tabs on what's going on all over your body, analyzing your blood for signs that something might be off. So let's revisit our fight or flight scene from a few lessons ago, the old burning house scenario. So you're sleeping. You're dreaming about petting pandas with Emma Watson or whatever when the smoke alarm goes off. Well, action potentials in your brain trigger neurons in your hypothalamus to release the peptide hormone CRH, or corticotropin-releasing hormone. The CRH makes the very short trip through the bloodstream to the anterior pituitary gland, where, because it is water-soluble, it binds to receptors on the outside of its target cells. There, it triggers the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. The ACTH travels again through the bloodstream to the adrenal cortices of the adrenal glands on top of your kidneys. When the ACTH binds to receptors on cells in an adrenal cortex, it triggers the release of a frenzy of different freak-out compounds known as glucocorticoid and mineralocorticoid hormones. Typically, these hormones help us deal with day-to-day stress by keeping our blood sugar and blood pressure balanced. But under major stress, like waking up in a burning building stress, these hormones, like cortisol, cause the classic fight-or-flight response, ramping up your blood pressure, dumping glucose into your bloodstream, shutting down non-emergency services like your immune system and sperm and egg development. And guess what? Now that all these stress hormones are pulsing through your blood, the hypothalamus back in the brain senses them. And because its job is to monitor and maintain balance whenever possible, it then stops secreting CRH, which eventually causes the other glands to stop secreting their panic hormones. Now, because this element of the stress response is hormonal rather than electrical, it comes on more slowly than the nervous system part, and it takes longer to subside too, as those stress hormones linger in the blood before being broken down by enzymes. So, we're a long way from teenage crushes and zits and crying over commercials at this point, aren't we? As a lifelong owner of hormones, I hope you'll join me in dispelling the stereotypes that surround these powerful and important chemicals and give them the respect they rightly deserve. Today, we looked at the endocrine system and how it uses glands to produce hormones. These hormones are either amino acid-based and water-soluble, or steroidal and lipid-soluble, and may target many types of cells or just turn on specific ones. We also touched on hormone cascades and how the HPA axis affects your stress response. Got a case study for you. Let me tell you about Marie. She was a healthy woman in her late 30s. She'd always been an active person, but at some point her energy level just seemed limitless. She was walking the dog 4 times a day, up at 5 in the morning, emailing her coworkers, and at midnight she was still awake, like dusting the ceiling fans. At first she felt great. She was super productive, but soon she started having trouble sleeping. She felt anxious all the time. She lost a lot of weight and noticed that she felt hot and sweaty when no one around her did. She started experiencing heart palpitations. Then one day her vision seemed blurry, and when she looked in the mirror, she was kind of surprised to find that her eyes were actually bulging out of their sockets. So yeah, she finally called a doctor, because, you know, bulging eyeballs. Marie's doctor referred her to an endocrinologist who, after running some tests, determined that the root of her problems was in her thyroid gland. The thyroid is one of the stars of your endocrine system. It's the little butterfly-shaped structure located anterior to your trachea and inferior to the larynx, or voice box. It may look cute and unassuming, but don't be fooled. The powerful hormones that it produces influence some of your most important physiological processes. These hormones, and many others, help maintain your chemical homeostasis, the balance and concentrations of substances like calcium, sodium, even water within very narrow ranges so that your body can provide a consistent internal environment for your cells. Your cells and the proteins in them need that stable environment to function, so if your body loses its homeostasis too dramatically, cellular function will stop, and as we say here on Crash Course Anatomy and Physiology, you will stop being alive. So your thyroid helps you avoid such a fate by secreting hormones that regulate many aspects of your body's homeostasis, like body temperature, skin moisture, and your blood's levels of oxygen, calcium, and cholesterol. It should come as no surprise that if the thyroid malfunctions and produces too much or too little of a hormone, it can lead to all sorts of weird and serious symptoms. And yet, thyroid disorders and the hormonal imbalances that accompany them are pretty common. It's pretty likely that you know at least one person, most likely a woman, who has experienced an issue with a dysfunctional thyroid, and many more of us are walking around with thyroid disorders and haven't even been diagnosed yet. In Marie's case, it turns out that she had Graves' disease, an immune system disorder that results in the overproduction of thyroid hormones, or hyperthyroidism. Although it's just one type of hormone disorder, looking at her symptoms can help us understand just how important, influential, and interconnected hormones are, and why they need to be properly balanced to maintain healthy homeostasis. And I cannot say this enough, homeostasis is life. Last time, we talked about hormone cascades and how a lot of the hormone activity that's bubbling along inside of you is the result of one kind of hormone bossing around the cells that produce another kind of hormone. These pathways typically start with an internal stimulus, often coming from the hypothalamus or pituitary gland, and end in the target glands that release hormones into the blood to get the real work of living done. We've seen how this kind of cascade controls your body's stress response through the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or HPA axis. Basically, your brain tells your hypothalamus to tell your pituitary to light a fire in your adrenal cortex, and in no time they've shut down digestion, released a bunch of energy, increased your blood pressure, and everything else you need to either fight or flee. And that's great! Your HPA axis is super useful when you are under stress and need to take action. But you do not need your adrenal cortex spouting off all the time. The truth is, much of the more basic, more fundamental business of everyday life is carried out by a different kind of cascade. It's the hypothalamus pituitary thyroid axis, or HPT axis, and it's what sets the thyroid gland into motion so it can regulate just about everything related to your homeostasis. For example, let's say you're caught outside on a cool day and you're underdressed. So let's say you were on a bus, busily texting your bestie, and you got off at a stop while searching for the emoji that most accurately depicted your reaction to the new Avengers movie when you realized that you'd left your jacket on the seat. There's nothing you can do to get your jacket back, but your hormones can do something about your coldness. Now, your nervous system, of course, has its own ways of detecting and signaling a change in temperature, but your endocrine system gets involved as soon as it senses that the temperature of your blood has changed. Your cooler than normal blood flows into your brain's hypothalamus, where it bumps up against temperature-sensitive sensory neurons, which act like a kind of thermostat. Once they detect that the temperature is below target levels, those neurons secrete thyrotropin-releasing hormone, or TRH, into the bloodstream. TRH is a tropic hormone, which means that it gets the hormone cascade started by triggering the release of other hormones. The cascade starts off with just a trickle as TRH goes just a few millimeters to the anterior pituitary, where it hits receptors on cells there, causing it to release thyroid-stimulating hormone, or TSH, into the bloodstream. That then travels down to the thyroid, finds its receptors, and slaps the gland to attention so it releases its own special thyroid hormone into the blood, where it can affect virtually every cell in your body. Like steroids, thyroid hormone is lipid-soluble, so it crosses the membrane of its target cell to bind inside the nucleus. There, it can make the cell either increase, decrease, or maintain its primary function. In this case, since you're feeling chilly, your body needs to stoke the fire a bit, and it does that by burning glucose. In your cells, burning glucose really means breaking it down so its component parts can be used to produce ATP. Thyroid hormone comes into play when it binds to receptors inside the nuclei of your muscle cells, triggering the transcription of DNA that makes the enzymes to break down that glucose. With more of these enzymes flowing around, more glucose is being broken up and more ATP is being produced, which is all a long way of describing the process that we call metabolism. But since the thyroid has increased the amount of chemical reactions going on, it also increased the amount of waste heat that's being generated. So this process has a calorogenic or heat-producing effect that helps warm you up. Now, whether or not you happen to forget your jacket on the bus and found yourself shivering on the way to work, your thyroid hormone produces all kinds of other effects as well, like maintaining your blood pressure, promoting the growth of tissues, and triggering the secretion of digestive juices to keep food moving through your digestive tract, just to name a few. So, thyroid hormone for the win, right? What's not to love? Well, what's important about the whole HTP axis is not just how it works, but also how it knows to turn off. Your glands need negative feedback in order to know when their job is done so they can stop secreting certain hormones. That's where your pituitary and hypothalamus come in. Remember, they're always monitoring hormone levels in your blood. If there's too much thyroid hormone, they both decrease their own hormone production to stop stimulating the thyroid. That, in turn, reduces thyroid hormone levels in the blood and slows down your metabolism again before you get overheated. At least that's what happens if everything's working the way it should. But there are millions of Maries out there, plenty of people, maybe even including you, who know full well that hormonal imbalances, thyroid-related or otherwise, happen all the time. Why? Well, thyroid disorders can be caused by lots of things, but in the case of our Marie, it's autoimmune dysfunction. Normally, when you get sick with a virus or bacteria or what have you, your immune system responds by sending out antibodies that target those invaders. Now, we don't fully understand why yet, but if you have something like Graves' disease, your body produces abnormal antibodies that target the cells of your thyroid gland itself. And instead of marking those cells for destruction like antibodies normally do, they do something even more bizarre. They mimic the hormones that the pituitary gland sends out, which bind to the thyroid's receptors. So even though the pituitary dials down its hormone production in an effort to get the thyroid to stop, the thyroid does not get the message because the receptors are still being activated. Basically, the gland never receives any negative feedback, so it just won't quit. And if your thyroid doesn't doesn't stop, it's hard for you to stop. So that's why Marie was always hot and sweaty. Her hypothalamus was screaming that she was warm enough, but those antibodies were hijacking the hormone cascade, and she was losing weight even though she was eating all the time because the thyroid hormone was no longer regulating her metabolism properly. But what about those big bulging eyes? Remember those? That was weird. Well, because they're part of the immune response, those disruptive antibodies often cause inflammation, particularly in the tissues around the eyes. In some cases, the swelling can be so severe that the eyes are no longer able to close. Treatment for Graves' disease involves either inhibiting the production of thyroid hormones or blocking their effects, basically getting your body chemistry back in order. The moral of the story is that hormones mean business, and by business I mean living, and by living what I really mean is, and everybody say it together now, homeostasis. In addition to learning to respect your hormones and thanking them for helping you live, hopefully today you learned something about chemical homeostasis and took away a greater understanding of hormone cascades. Specifically, we looked at the hypothalamus-pituitary-thyroid axis, or HPT axis, and all the ways your body can suffer when that system, or your hormones in general, get out of whack.
Nestled in the tissues of your neck is a small, unassuming organ that wields enormous power over your body. It's called the thyroid. Like the operations manager in a company, its role is to make sure that the cells in your body are working properly. It does that by using hormones to deliver messages to every single one of them. This high-ranking organ is made up of lobules that each contain smaller cells called follicles, which store the hormones the thyroid sends out into your blood. Two of the most important hormones it produces are thyroxine and triiodothyronine, or T3 and T4. As messengers, the hormone's job is to instruct every cell in the body when to consume oxygen and nutrients. That maintains the body's metabolism, the series of reactions our cells perform to provide us with energy. This hormonal notification from the thyroid gets the heart pumping more efficiently and makes our cells break down nutrients faster. When you need more energy, the thyroid helps by sending out hormones to increase metabolism. Ultimately, the thyroid allows our cells to use energy, grow, and reproduce. The thyroid is controlled by the pituitary gland, a hormonal gland deep in the brain that oversees the thyroid's tasks, making sure it knows when to send out its messengers. The pituitary's role is to sense if hormone levels in the blood are too low or too high, in which case it sends out instructions in the form of the thyroid-stimulating hormone. Even in this tightly controlled system, however, management sometimes slips up. Certain diseases, growths in the thyroid, or chemical imbalances in the body can confuse the organ and make it deaf to the pituitary's guiding commands. The first problem this causes is hyperthyroidism, which happens when the organ sends out too many hormones. That means the cells are overloaded with instructions to consume nutrients and oxygen. They become overactive as a result, meaning a person with hyperthyroidism experiences a higher metabolism, signaled by a faster heartbeat, constant hunger, and rapid weight loss. They also feel hot, sweaty, anxious, and find it difficult to sleep. The opposite problem is hypothyroidism, which happens when the thyroid sends out too few hormones, meaning the body's cells don't have as many messengers to guide them. In response, cells grow listless and metabolism slows. People with hypothyroidism see symptoms in weight gain, sluggishness, sensitivity to cold, swollen joints, and feeling low. Luckily, there are medical treatments that can help trigger the thyroid's activities again and bring the body back to a steady metabolic rate. For such a little organ, the thyroid wields an awful lot of power. But a healthy thyroid manages our cells so effectively that it can keep us running smoothly without us even noticing it's there.
Are you sleeping restlessly, feeling irritable or moody, forgetting little things, and feeling overwhelmed and isolated? Don't worry, we've all been there. You're probably just stressed out. Stress isn't always a bad thing. It can be handy for a burst of extra energy and focus, like when you're playing a competitive sport or have to speak in public. But when it's continuous, the kind most of us face day in and day out, it actually begins to change your brain. Chronic stress, like being overworked or having arguments at home, can affect brain size, its structure, and how it functions, right down to the level of your genes. Stress begins with something called the hypothalamus-pituitary-adrenal axis, a series of interactions between endocrine glands in the brain and on the kidney, which controls your body's reaction to stress. When your brain detects a stressful situation, your HPA axis is instantly activated and releases a hormone called cortisol, which primes your body for instant action. But high levels of cortisol over long periods of time wreak havoc on your brain. For example, chronic stress increases the activity level and number of neural connections in the amygdala, your brain's fear center. And as levels of cortisol rise, electric signals in your hippocampus, the part of the brain associated with learning, memories, and stress control, deteriorate. The hippocampus also inhibits the activity of the HPA axis, so when it weakens, so does your ability to control your stress. That's not all though. Cortisol can literally cause your brain to shrink in size. Too much of it results in the loss of synaptic connections between neurons and the shrinking of your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that regulates behaviors like concentration, decision-making, judgment, and social interaction. It also leads to fewer new brain cells being made in the hippocampus. This means chronic stress might make it harder for you to learn and remember things, and also set the stage for more serious mental problems like depression and eventually Alzheimer's disease. The effects of stress may filter right down to your brain's DNA. An experiment showed that the amount of nurturing a mother rat provides its newborn baby plays a part in determining how that baby responds to stress later in life. The pups of nurturing moms turned out less sensitive to stress because their brains developed more cortisol receptors, which stick to cortisol and dampen the stress response. The pups of negligent moms had the opposite outcome, and so became more sensitive to stress throughout life. These are considered epigenetic changes, meaning that they affect which genes are expressed without directly changing the genetic code. And these changes can be reversed if the moms are swapped. But there's a surprising result. The epigenetic changes caused by one single mother rat were passed down to many generations of rats after her. In other words, the results of these actions were inheritable. It's not all bad news though. There are many ways to reverse what cortisol does to your stressed brain. The most powerful weapons are exercise and meditation, which involves breathing deeply and being aware and focused on your surroundings. Both of these activities decrease your stress and increase the size of the hippocampus, thereby improving your memory. So don't feel defeated by the pressures of daily life. Get in control of your stress before it takes control of you.